Welcome back to the David Douglas Show. On today's episode, we'll be covering the drink that's with you during your highs and your lows when you finally win your men's softball league, beating your rival neighbor Steve, whose dogs never stop barking at 1 a.m. when you have to be up at 8 a.m. This is the drink you go to when it's New Year's Eve and you realize the girl you've been flirting with for the last 3 hours has locked eyes with a man taller, wider, more powerful than you. And as the clock gets closer to midnight, she starts trailing towards his direction. You turn to this drink, for champagne is with you in your highs and your lows, and that's what this episode's all about. This is the David Douglas Show. Champagne has a storied history. As usual, we'll start there, and then we'll get to the modern day. What I love about wine in general, and it's hit home particularly when it comes to champagne, is that it's something that the monks got up to. Like, one of the few things they could do to turn up, they couldn't have much fun, but they could make alcohol. And they probably drank a lot of it. In many cultures, alcohol was considered safer than water to drink. It had less likeliness to have germs and bacteria that could kill you. So everybody was kind of turning up all the time. It was terrible for the collective IQ and productivity of the nation, but it was probably a pretty fun time. And of course, champagne starts, as it must, in Champagne, France, which is the northeastern corner of the city, of the country. And as I'm sure most of you know, champagne can only be called champagne if it's from this region. And the grapes that champagne is named after come from the Campania region of Italy. Let's take a look-see at that, which is just south of the Naples area. Perhaps it contains Naples. It's one of those two. I'm not going to fact-check it, but I am going to show you the rolling hills of Champagne. And what was interesting about... Oh, God, that is beautiful. That is gorgeous. Has Hideki Miyazaki... I messed up his name. The Studio Ghibli folks should make a movie that's set in Champagne, France, because this would be a beautiful site for their animation. And what's interesting about Champagne is that it has the weather that could induce champagne. How is that? Well, champagne is characterized by its bubbles, which are due to a second fermentation. And what would happen in Champagne, France, is that the monks there would get the wine, they would put it into storage as it's ready to ferment and create alcohol. But what would happen in the winters in France, as opposed to maybe Spain or Italy where it's a bit warmer, in the Champagne region, it was just cold enough where fermentation would stop in the winter because it was too cold. Bacteria likes heat. Any girlie who's had a mold-filled apartment knows that a little heat and moisture are bacteria's best friends. So as it stopped the fermentation in the winter, when that heat came back in the spring, fermentation would reignite. A second fermentation would result in bubbles. Why does the second fermentation and not the first fermentation create bubbles? That I could not tell you. That is something to ask a woman who makes kombucha. Because I think on the first fermentation, those have bubbles. Perhaps not enough. But I do love those videos of beautiful women who rock climb making kombucha and then forgetting to let the gas out, and then they burst. And that also happens with champagne. In the champagne making process, there's something called disgorgement. And disgorgement is when they let the bubbles out. Now, in champagne, before they got to disgorgement, bottles would be exploding. Things would not be going well. And a 1662 scientist named Christopher Merritt, I love looking at old men pictures and old women pictures, old pictures, okay? We don't discriminate. But look at this gentleman and his luscious locks, who probably did not look this smooth skin, let's be real. Probably had like pock marks on his face like everyone did back in the day. But he documented in 1662 that, now this had been going on and experiments had been done. People have noticed this, both second fermentation and both bottles exploding. This was a thing that was known. But in 1662, he noted and documented that the addition of sugar could induce on a regular basis this second fermentation that was occasionally happening in the Champagne region of France. And 6 years later, a gentleman whose name still stands today in the champagne bottles of fancy hotels, clubs with the girls, with the sparklers, with the guys who own a VC company paying too much money, he still lives on in those visages as Mr. Dom Perignon. And he was the guy who got things rolling on Champagne. He was the guy who took this little phenomenon that was happening in Champagne, France, this little phenomenon that had been noticed, that had been 6 years before even documented and kind of scientifically understood, this second fermentation that could create bubbles. He said, let's get cooking on this. This is going to be my thing that I'm tinkering on because I'm a monk. I'm not allowed to get with the ladies. And a man who's not allowed to get with the ladies has to focus on something. And we know how the Roman Catholics do it. But he wasn't a Roman Catholic. He was a Benedictine monk, hence the bald top. Robin Hood, I believe, was Benedictine monk as well. But that was set in the times of the Benedictine monks. So in 1638, he was born. And he did a couple of things to make Champagne this regular, continual thing that could be a process. The first thing he did was blending the grapes. Now, what he was trying to achieve was a more consistent product. You need something that's going to kind of taste the same and ferment the same every time, especially if you're going for this bubbly result. He also was the first to lightly press, so lightly weigh down and press over time, red grapes to produce a white juice. This was not done before that. He added stronger bottles to make sure they didn't shatter because he was going for a gaseous statement like Jupiter. And he also took hemp rope and he tied them around as a little cage on the top of the bottle, which is very similar to the aluminum metal cages they have around champagne bottles. You usually twist, take off the cage, then you can pop it. So he was doing that with hemp rope. And he established this method champonis. He's the father of it. He didn't start it. It was getting cooking before then. People had started working on these techniques. But he's the one who really made a lot of progress on it to the point where it was established well after that. The method champonis is a step-by-step process that you can follow to consistently not just ferment grapes and make a tasty wine, but get a bubbly, effervescent champagne. And now, one of the largest champagne brands, Moet Chandon, produce a brand named after him. And that's how you get a Benedictine monk in the club. That's how it happens. So this dude was kind of the cool guy of the hour for Champagne, but it has its regal roots even earlier than him. First of all, in the 9th century, French kings were crowned in the Reims town, the town of Reims in Champagne region. Let's check out a 9th century painting. Check out that guy. Also probably looked horrifying at the time due to inbreeding, but let's not get into that. So this was already, for France, a sort of regal, sort of fancy region, because that's where the kings were crowned. And as Dom Perignon started getting this method champonis down, in the 18th century, it became the official drink of coronation banquets. So this area of France was already associated with royalty, with regalness, with fanciness. And then all of a sudden, this drink that's being developed there that has a little pizzazz, has a little show, has something no other wine has, a bubbly, fubbly, mubbly moment, becomes the official drink of the coronation banquet. And that is sort of the start of the brand, where the minds of people are infected with this idea that this bubbly wine called champagne is associated with greatness. Just like the kings would wear enormous jewels to show everyone else, we are better than you, they started showing everyone we are better than you by having a bubbly drink. And this concept then started spreading. It became exported in sturdy bottles, champagne. The method became more and more standardized. Folks realized you could rotate the bottles to collect the yeast sediment in the neck. That after the bubbles were released, you could add just a little bit of sugar and wine mixture to balance the acidity. Do you want a more sweet or more acidic wine? It's all about getting a consistent product here. And of course, the wine cages were added, as well as the mushroom-shaped corks, which are a little fatter at the bottom to discourage them to come off until the time is right. And then three big players started spreading champagne around the world. Moet, Veuve Clicquot, Moet and Chandon, Veuve Clicquot, and Cristal continued increasing production as standards and methods became more regular, and they pushed the idea of it being a luxury drink. It started getting associated with travel as well, being served on the Titanic as well as the Oriental Express. And it's still to this day associated with winning, with success, with luxury. Every sporting champion, no matter the event, F1, NBA Finals, Stanley Cup, they all pop a bottle of champagne, usually many bottles of champagne, after winning. And if you see what they're doing there in those moments, it also kind of sums up the fact that champagne is a brand. That it's not just about drinking it, and that so many people, when they're popping the bottles, they are just spraying the champagne everywhere. Champagne isn't necessarily about drinking it. It's about showing a celebration. And that is one thing that you can do with bubbles. You can make a show. You can spray it everywhere. So who are the big producers nowadays of champagne? Because it's gone from a coronation drink of France to a worldwide phenomenon. Well, I mentioned a lot of them already. The biggest producer is Moet and Chandon. They produce 30 million bottles a year, and the brand is worth $1.4 billion. They were founded in 1743, and they became a very popular champagne maker. They were very popular with King Louis XV, for example. And Jean-Remy Moet, the founder's grandson, spread it to the Napoleon, who famously said, "In victory you deserve to drink champagne, in defeat you need it." A line I've said many times myself. In fact, was the first thing I mentioned in this podcast, that when you're down on your luck, you want it. When you're up high on your luck, you also want it. Now, Moet's flagship Brut Imperial launched in 1860 and is still its best seller. It's crafted from 200 crus, or grape wines. Crus are what they call the sort of base of the champagne before it goes through the whole process to become its bubbly final product. And the other thing that's interesting about the brand now that produces 30 million bottles a year is that they become a luxury titan. They merged with Hennessy, the liquor brand, in the 20th century, and then Louis V to become a luxury titan called LVMH, which there could be a whole podcast just about LVMH. It's sort of a superhero, supervillain luxury brand in that it gobbles up its competition and it dominates. Are they evil people? I cannot tell you. I'm just scared of the rich. As many Americans, until you become rich, you are scared of them. And I'm in the I hope I become them region of my life right now. They own 75 luxury brands, LVMH. Louis Vuitton, Moet, Hennessy is what those letters stand for, across wine, spirits, perfumes, jewelry, and fashion. Tiffany & Co., for example, in the jewelry section. They're 4 times bigger than the next luxury conglomerate. They have $85 billion in revenue, which is the same as Dell Computers, one of the largest companies here in the US, and they have a freakish dominance of the luxury industry with a succession-like family lineage. Running their largest brands like Tiffany and Louis V are members of this family. It is a publicly traded company, but the board seats are controlled by these family members. And as wealth inequality grows, which, as many of you know, it's been growing, and there's no signs it's going to stop growing, so does their success. It's sort of a hedge against life being good for many people, as the wealthy use capital to suck the money out of laborers. They start spending it on more LVMH products. Moet also owns Dom Perignon, the first prestige cuvée or champagne, which we'll talk more about. We've already talked about, and we'll talk more about their brand individually. But first, let's look at the Moet facilities. For how are they going to make 30 million bottles without any ridiculous and preposterous, beautiful French facility? Look at that. Now, on these lands, they obviously have this showroom over here where people can walk in, but they also have massive amounts of wine caves. This is originally where the wines were stored, and it's still where they're stored. And in these wine caves, they have millions of bottles that are aging. And how long do they age? Well, many different years in the 17 miles of underground wine cellars. And they'll age them for different amount of years, and then they'll release them. And based on how long they were aged, for one factor, is what makes them more or less valuable. Alongside of these 17 miles of underground wine cellars, they have 1,300 hectares of vineyards. 50% are Grand Cru considered. 25% are considered Premier Cru. Now, what's the difference? Those are distinctions for towns within the Champagne region and how high quality the terroir, the land, is for growing grapes. There's a society, a government agency that ranks these. Now, of course, different vineyards obviously still vary, but they're saying this soil in this town, it's a per town ranking, is particularly good for growing grapes. It makes particularly interesting, delicious, and fertile land. In wine, you will hear that word terroir a lot. And it's because the idea is that you can plant the same grapes, the same seeds in different soils and get a much different product. So by saying that these particular villages have particularly fertile soil, it's a way to indicate the quality that you might get out of the grapes. Now, keep in mind, you still have to do the rest of the production, the growing, etc., etc. Now, one thing that was interesting about when they're the second largest to Moet and Chandon's competition, the second largest, is Veuve Cloquet. Their orange label, I'm sure you've seen when you were shopping for your New Year's Eve selection, trying to find a champagne that indicated you weren't cheap, but you also weren't trying to spend too much money. What I like about them is they were the first major woman-led business in the 19th century. Now, having a woman-owned business nowadays, still cool, still interesting, still offers a different perspective many times than a business led by a man. Women just have different interests. They bring different things to the table. But being the first major woman-owned business in the 19th century must have been wild. To go into rooms and demand the respect of folks you were going to work with who maybe hadn't worked with a woman before from a peer-to-peer perspective. If you're talking to another CEO of another company, yeah, maybe they have women that work for them, but that they are seeing eye to eye with. And this lady, Barbe Nicole Ponsardino, known as Madame Cliquet, was that first lady. Let's take a look. Boom! Fucking, she rules. She rules. I love her so much. She looks like the Tyrell grandma from Game of Thrones. She looks like she runs this town. Like, she's walking into the room. The men are eyes wide. And she's quickly establishing that if they want to work with her, they're going to have to get over that. Oh, man. To see the reactions of people's as she ran shit would have been chef's kiss. She invented the riddling table, which is a device that helps you collect sediment. I'll show a picture of it here. This is where they rotate those bottles, as I was talking about earlier, to collect the sediment in the stem at the very top of the bottle, so they can later get that sediment out during disgorgement. She also created rosé champagne by mixing red and white wines, and she broke into the Russian market during the Napoleonic Wars. She's a badass in the true sense, not because she's a girl, just because she does doing whatever she wants when no one was telling her she could. Like going into a war area and being like, hey, you're going to want some bubbly alcohol. Take some je ne sais quoi. Now, Dom Perignon, as we mentioned earlier, owned by Moet and Chandon, itself is valued at $800 million, and it's considered the first prestige cuvée, where they were really saying, we're finding the best grapes, we're treating them best we could, and we're making champagne that is a tier above the rest. It's not just about being delicious and bubbly, it's about being a quality level that is inherently harder to find. Some ways they do this is they are a vintage-only brand, which means the grapes are all coming from the same year. The more sources you have for grapes, on one hand, the more consistent product you can have, which many of these champagne makers value. On the other hand, having from different years, although it makes the process easier, gives it less distinction and less character. So what they do is they each year look at the grapes and they decide if they're high quality enough to use as one collective vintage. Now, the other years, are they using those grapes for something else? Probably. Are they selling them to another brand to make a lesser drink with? Maybe, I'm guessing. I don't actually know, but that makes sense to me. But only 6 of the 10 years are they considered high quality enough grapes to produce wine. So right there, that's where you start getting to that prestige cuvée. You're not saying, what do we get this year? Let's make the best we can. You're saying, we have a quality standard, and that's what we're going to aim for. And what we get is what we get, and you guys can figure it out after that. They use Pinot Noir and Chardonnay primarily, and they blend with varying percentages per year, depending on the vintage, depending how the grapes grow. And they're aged for a minimum of 7 years. And then they release those aged champagnes in different plentitudes, different releases. So the same vintage, again, vintage means a year of grapes. So the same year of grapes may be released 9, 18 years, and 25 years after those grapes were actually grown, after they've been aging. So they may have grown, and then 9, 18, and 25 years they were released in these different areas. So you can have the same season, the same year of grapes, the same vintage, and it develops in different ways over longer times. Obviously, as the aging goes longer, so does the price get higher. As they are supposedly, got more character and more interest to them. But like many things, it's just a reflection of the time, effort, and exclusivity it takes to age a wine 25 years. It might not actually taste better, but is it harder to get? Yeah. Is it rarer? Absolutely. Does it take more effort? For sure. And it's charged accordingly. And many luxury brands are built around this concept of exclusivity. So who cares what the product is? If your neighbor doesn't have it, you feel great about your purchase. And they have a wine master, a cellar master, who is this gentleman right here. I'm failing to enter the site. I have the Dom Perignon's website, and I'm failing to enter. Oh, it's because I need to enter my date of birth. I'm trying to type without looking at my hands, and it's not working. Story of my life right there. Story of my life. Is it important that we do this? Probably not. Is it important that I eventually get a producer? Probably so. All right, let's take a look at this gentleman. Here he is, artistically posed with a wine glass as the ocean crashes around him, somewhere in France, assumingly. And he says, we must intimately know our vineyards and our wines. We have to pamper them, learn to love them, and to create assemblages that strive for harmony. I'm sure he does not have a British accent. I'm sure he's quite French. Here he is sniffing and staring at wine. He's the chief de cave, the leader of the cave. That beautiful ancient vineyard. Wine is pretty cool because it is so storied, I must admit. Even as it is terrifying as a luxury good, you do have to appreciate the fact that they are taking 25 years to create a product. He's been overseeing the cellars since 1990. Must be doing a good job. So what makes champagne champagne? Well, there's two things. The process it's made in and the region that it's created in. For like many products, it has a state-protected legality. Tequila can only come from Tequila, Mexico. Jalisco, Mexico? I don't remember anymore. San Marzano tomatoes are different than tomatoes of the San Marzano type that are made in California. They must come from the Valley of San Marzano, under the volcanic ash of the Mount Vesuvius that creates the delicious soil the tomatoes are grown in. And champagne is legally protected in France as a PDO, a protected designation of origin, which is a law that ensures the inspection of champagne to make sure it holds up certain standards, the boundaries of the Champagne region, and implements a law that actually creates a force of people to do the inspections as well as defend it legally in different ways. So there's the AOC, the Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, which inspects and implements laws regarding the aging, processing of champagne making. So they are protecting the brand in a few ways, but the first way they do that is saying this is the definition of champagne. The idea is that if someone is making something and calling it champagne, and this other fella starts making a weaker product that doesn't actually follow what champagne is, maybe it's got bubbles added some other way, that's going to be worse for everyone who owns a champagne making factory. If people can associate it with a certain level of quality, that's better for the folks that have it. So they are inspecting how you're actually making it. Then there's the Comité Interprofessionnel du Vin de Champagne, CIVC. And that is an organization that will investigate other folks using the name incorrectly, perhaps, and protect it by suing or following up legal action on groups that use the name champagne when it's not meant to be used. For example, they sued to make sure champagne could not be used in non-alcoholic beverages. So you couldn't call something a NA champagne because they sued to say, hey, this is the definition of champagne. We have it legally protected, and it doesn't follow our designation, so you can't use the term champagne. And champagne protection is in many of France's trade agreements as well. So if you violate that protection, right? If you start someone in the US starts saying, hey, this is champagne, that is champagne. Yeah, maybe the French courts don't have oversight over you, particularly as a U.S. citizen, but they'll put pressure on the U.S. and saying, hey, this is part of our trade agreement. If you want to still keep importing French products and selling American products in France, you better get your boy over there. You better go collect that. And these types of agreements are very strong throughout the world because governments tend to want to play ball when it comes to trade with this sort of stuff. If you lose the protection of French products, you lose the protection of American products. And then it all falls apart. There's also cru rankings. So crus represent the terroirs. So I remember I talked before about the Moet, 50% of their hectares are grand crus, which are the highest quality level. And these represent the quality of the soil, its growing conditions, the microbiomes, the altitude, and the sunlight exposure. In totality, how good that village is as a site to grow grapes in. 17 villages hold the rating of 100% or Grand Cru on the scale, the Chelle de Cru scale. These are considered the highest quality grapes in growing environments, and about 9% of Champagne vineyards in the Champagne region, are considered the Grand Cru rating. Then there's Premier Cru, which is 44 villages, scoring a 90 to 90% on this scale, which comprises of 22% of the Champagne region. So about 30% in total are the top two rankings. Everything else is considered just a cru or other cru. And that makes up the majority of the vineyards in Champagne. So those are the physical geography and the legal protections around that geography. And the other thing that the law sets apart is some of the process as well. Typically the grapes, this isn't necessarily a legal definition, but typically the grapes are hand-picked Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meuniers. They're pressed gently in the first press, which creates the cuvée, while later pressings are Taille and lesser. So cuvée literally means first pressing. If you keep pressing the grapes, you get worse wine out of it. After the champagne is pressed, after the wine is gotten out, the cuvée, I should say, is gotten out. It's not wine yet. It is put in a first fermentation in steel or oak barrels, and that makes still wine, which we're familiar with. Then there's the assemblage. This is where the champagne method begins. So you start blending these still wines to create a base wine. Sometimes they're from different vineyards. Sometimes they're different varietals, grapes. Sometimes they're even from different years. And what the person is trying to do is put together a group of still wines that in their totality are interesting, delicious, consistent. Then they're put into a second fermentation. The blended base is mixed with sugar and yeast and sealed. So it's already still wine, and now it's got a little extra sugar and yeast. And that's yeast start to consume the sugar, making more alcohol and bubbles over 1 to 3 weeks. Then they are aged in the bottle, where the dead yeast breaks down. Legally, a non-vintage must do this for 15 months. A vintage requires 3 years to call yourself vintage of the same year you are growing the grapes. That's what vintage means, not different years of grapes. After that, a minimum of 3 years or 15 months, the riddling or rumage happens. That's when the bottles are now angled, as we saw by the lady who ran Vouvet Couclet, invented. They're angled on racks, so the sediment, the dead yeast and sediment collects at the bottom, well, not the bottom, the top, if you were putting it on a table, in the neck. And then they are frozen in a saltwater solution during the disgorgement process. So this is after a couple weeks or months being turned upside down, not upside down, but at an angle down, so that the end of it is all the sediment. And then that same skinny part of the neck is frozen in salt water. The cap is then removed, and the bottle expels ice and sediment in the process. Let's take a look at how that all plays out.
Après, c'est pas après le geste, la
I hear some French.
parole, mais après la parole, le geste.
Here's a man with a bottle. He's aiming it at some sort of barrel that's got a side of it cut out, and he's got something he's about to, looks like he's about to pop open this bottle.
Première bouteille, trouver son équilibre. C'est parti.
Boom! Out of that bottle just came the frozen plug of ice and sediment. So just the part that is mostly sediment was turned to ice, which then shoots out based on the gas, and then you'll see him cover a bit of the bottle. So not too much of the more of the liquid comes out. Mostly you're just trying to get that ice cap out. He's going to do it again.
Si je dois me décaler, il faut me dire.
Boom, cover it. The ice and the yeast is
Un
out.
petit geste
In this case, he is sucking up the extra bubbles. Iconically.
pour calmer le... C'est-à-dire qu'on a toutes des techniques.
Pop.
On doit s'adapter.
Out comes the ice and sediment. In stays most of the delicious champagne. After the disgorgement, the most exciting and fun, explosive part of the process comes the dosage, where a small amount of wine and sugar mixture is added to adjust the sweetness levels, which there are of 4: brut, natural, brut, nature, no sugar, brut, very dry, demi-sec, medium sweet, and the doux, sweetest. Then there is the corking and aging. The bottles are now corked with a mushroom cap and cage. What you get for that, they might have had a metal cap on top, and now they are aged more to enhance complexity, potentially. They don't have to be, but they could be. They're in their final product. They're no longer fermenting. They're no longer adding extra bubbles, but they are now a bubbly, captured process that can still age in the bottle. We've also got a video.
Le terroir champenois, il est
From the Moet and Chandon crew, which goes over that entire process that we just went through. It starts for them with the terroir. They're talking about how the land that they have, these rolling hills of vineyards, produce, supposedly the best grapes. Of course, then it's planted by hand. They go over the grape varietals, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay. It's harvested by hand. It does look beautiful. Blended up, tasting still wines. This is what the cellar master and his crew are a lot of part of, making sure that the still wines are combined in a way that will yield an interesting product in the end. It is then matured. It is riddled. It is then disgorged. Popping that bottle. They do it. Do they have a machine that will pop these thousands at a time? Which is pretty incredible. Incredible. And that's the two things that make champagne champagne. The legal region of the world it comes from, and the step-by-step process they have to follow to create the final product. That is, of course, inspected and followed up by French authorities to make sure that what is being produced deserves the name champagne, because just as they make sure lesser products aren't being used in other countries with the name, they make sure the products that are coming out of their own country live up to the standard, so that the folks that do make it can all benefit collectively from people associating champagne with delicious bubbles. Now, champagne has more affordable cousins that have less prestige associated with them, but still a delicious bubbly texture. There's Crémant, which is French, but other parts of France. Not made in Champagne necessarily, so it can't be called Champagne. And because of that, it's not using the name Champagne. There's also less legal restriction, so it can be shorter fermented. Maybe they can skip a couple steps in terms of the aging. They're trying to produce a cheaper, more quick, bubbly liquid. There's also Prosecco, which is the Italian cousin, is often in stainless steel barrels for fermenting, and it is often a bit sweeter, considered a more casual drink than champagne. There's Cava, which follows the same production, so same champagne method. It's often drier than champagne, but it has less production costs because the grape harvest is more reliable in Spain due to the warmer weather. Of course, people in Champagne would tell you the variety of the weather creates a more interesting product, but the Cava folks probably can use more of their grapes because the weather's more consistent and warmer. Then there's Franchiorta. Now, Prosecco doesn't use necessarily the full process, the method de champagnis, but Francoretta does. So it's essentially champagne, but it's made in Italy. But it is typically cheaper because it's in lesser demand. It doesn't have the prestige name that drives the price up for champagne. And then there's Sekt, S-E-K-T, which is a German and Austrian version. Traditional, could be the traditional method, or it could be tank stainless steel and lower ferment times. There's also natural champagne. Natural wine is a non-regulated movement within the wine community that encourages organic biodynamic farming, native yeasts, which mean the yeasts come from the area they're in instead of being shipped in from a commercial plant that makes yeast. And perhaps most importantly, they try to have minimal or no sulfur added. Sulfur is typically used to preserve a wine or make it more consistent in its final process, but it also isn't necessarily in the spirit that the frankincense monks had. They didn't have access to sulfites. So if we look up the Champagne Chavost website here, you'll see their first thing they say under the Champagne Chavost logo is no added sulfates. Our champagnes are similar, singular and atypical. Their own identity comes from mastered vinification and absolute absence of added sulfites. They grow their wines in a conscious, environmentally friendly way, according to them. And they have their beautiful vineyards in the tiny town of Chavost. Only, I think, 5 acres worth of land. Pretty cool stuff. It's considered the hipster side of champagne, as is natural wine in general. I hope to do a full episode on natural wine because it's something I'm deeply interested in. This idea that you're supposed to get the grapes, ferment them, and that's it. It's kind of a decommercialization in many ways of wine. Now, hilariously, I did want to look up the most expensive bottle of champagne, and it was sold for $2.5 million because it was associated with an NFT. You got one of those bored monkey apes NFTs when that was popular. Remember Justin Bieber bought one for like $1 million? Well, there was a bottle of champagne that came with one. It was sold for $2.5 million, which is horrible because the next most expensive bottle was found in a shipwreck in 1916, had no NFT, and was sold for $275,000. So there's like the sad truth. There's also a brand called Armand de Brenac, which sells a Brut Gold in a Midas size. Oh, sorry, the Brut Gold Midas is the sub brand they produce, which are bottles that are 40. They're so large there is 40 bottles worth of wine in it, and they sold one for $51,000 a couple years back. The last interesting thing about champagne is that 25% of sales are in the weeks I think it's maybe 10 days, 6 days, 7 days, 7 days between Christmas and New Year's. It is so associated in the US with New Year's that 25% of all bottles bought are in 1 week. 360 million glasses are consumed in the US every year on New Year's. And next time New Year's rolls around, as you're sipping your bubbles, you can think about the fact that a monk in France realized you can consistently get these bubbles by following this whole method, and all these people that involved themselves and found different techniques that became standardized, and the large companies that brought up all this land in this particular part of France so they could make millions and millions of bottles as consistently as they could, so we could all celebrate a new year and some new beginnings. Thank you for listening to this episode of The David Douglas Show. Hopefully you learned some things about Champagne and the Champagne region, and I'm excited to see you guys on the next episode.